Hi, Emily. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
For sure, for sure. This is actually pretty fun for me. I don't often get to interview colleagues about their backgrounds, where they've been, what they've done. It's kind of pulling back the curtain for me as much as it is for everybody else. So kick us off here, and we ask our panelists all the same question to start. Tell us a little bit about what's your job title, what's your educational background, where'd you go to high school, college, and how did you end up in the position you're in today?
Well, I am Emily Laidlaw, Policy Director for Governor Gretchen Whitmer. I grew up in Birmingham, Michigan, and I went to MSU, and I'm a proud Spartan. From there, I ended up working on campaigns for a couple of years and transitioned into a policy role, which I fell in love with public policy. And I think you and I met probably 15 years ago when I transitioned into that role.
Yeah.
You and I ended up in the same spot, both advocating for schools for several years. And it was in that role, representing several intermediate school districts and other associations, that I was tapped by Governor-elect Gretchen Whitmer to serve on her transition team as her education policy point person. And from there, I really felt a connection with the team and her vision and values, and was asked to stay on as policy director and have been there ever since.
So tell me a little bit about the job of policy director, because your background, like mine, is education policy. And we kind of, to that point, we'd sort of specialized a little bit in education policy. And now you're the policy director writ large for the governor's team. What are the kinds of things you're dealing with? What are your roles and responsibilities in that job?
Well, it's no secret to people that know me that education policy is always going to be my favorite issue area. However, after taking this job, I had to consciously back really far out and hire a staff of people that I trusted in order to get into the nitty-gritty of the specific issue area policy work. My job as the policy director is to pull together the pieces of policy that end up being signature policies for the governor. So if you think about that, think about the governor's goal of 60% post-secondary attainment by 2030. And the ideas for a Reconnect scholarship to get people back to school to achieve that post-secondary attainment. Or more related to the education space, how we budget for education. The governor's signature policy there is ensuring equity through a weighted foundation formula. You know, I could go through a bucket: health, water, environment, has 2 or 3 issues that the governor chooses to be her signature policy issues. And it's my job to ensure that those issues are the right issues for her, that they reflect her values, and to make sure that she is successful in achieving the goals, both policy-wise, and to bring the right stakeholder groups together in order to have success.
So that's pretty far-reaching. I mean, you're branching between multiple issue areas, multiple departments within state government, multiple stakeholders. So you're bringing together education people with human services folks, with environmental policy advocates, potentially. Can you describe what that process looks like, what goes into developing new policies or reworking existing policies?
Sure.
From your perspective within the EOG?
Before I started with the administration, I was solely focused on the legislative branch of creating public policy. What I quickly learned after starting this job is how far in advance the Executive Office of the Governor starts planning for those core issues. We're bringing together department heads and stakeholders from individual departments far before something is launched, months, sometimes years. We have a long range plan, a short range plan, and some of those items go through the legislative process to become policy, to become law, but some of those items go through an administrative process and can create change for constituents in Michigan via administrative rule or guidance or memos. There's many different ways from the executive office to make policy change. It takes it takes a lot of time in order to make sure that you have the right vehicle to enact the policy change that you're looking for. So that's what a lot of the work up front is focused on. The two most important things that I've learned is leading with the governor's values. What is the value that she would like to see reflected in the policy change that we're pursuing? And ensuring that you have the right vehicle for change, whether it's an administrative action, a legislative action, or sometimes even a court action.
Okay. And so in your previous life, when we worked together, you were lobbying for school districts, intermediate school districts, elementary school principals, among others. When you were more heavily focused on the legislature, now that you're seeing this different perspective from inside, I said the EOG before, Executive Office of the Governor, right?
Yep.
Make sure I got my acronyms right.
You got it.
Now that you're seeing this different process, do you have a more robust appreciation for the policymaking process and all the different vehicles that are out there? How has this changed your perspective on policymaking as a whole?
I think my view of policymaking as a whole has become far more broad than when I started. There are a million different ways to make change, whether that is at the local school board or even local building level, all the way up to administrative action from the President of the United States. So having an appreciation for the different mechanisms to help people and achieve the governor's values has been very inspiring for me in my career, and really opened up a lot of thought process for me to be creative with this process.
Yeah, no, I can see where you would be able to go in so many different directions and pursue so many different channels to achieve things, but also how many different people throughout the system have an input in the process, that it's not just something handed down from on high, but there are so many different moving pieces in the system.
And that ends up being the most difficult piece is, there's that silly saying, and of course now I'm repeating it, so forgive me, keep the main thing the main thing. Oftentimes, we see this in legislative politics through the policy process, but even more so when you have more choices of how to enact public policy. People want to add different elements to a policy, and you take away from the change that you're trying to make. I think, some examples of that include some of the discussion we had around Futures for Frontliners, which is a program that we launched for public workers to go back and get their post-secondary degree. There was a lot of discussion about who should be included in this program. And the answer is, we want everybody who wants a post-secondary degree to come back and take one and get one. But we're limited by federal funding. So we had to make tough choices about who would qualify, utilizing our department's expertise, utilizing the expertise from the field, from the associations that represent these frontline workers, to ensure that the program is successful and that we can build on it in future years so that more people can receive the benefit of a post-secondary education. If that was not done in a way that made logical sense for the program to be successful, you lose the impact of the launch of such a large program and the impact that you can have by changing people's lives by giving them an access to a post-secondary education. So I hope that helps explain what I mean.
Sure. I mean, you also have, as you said, trying to find a focus within a program, trying to focus it in on those areas that are going to matter most. You also struggle with, honestly, people like me who see something moving and want to use that as a vehicle potentially to add or advocate for something else that they're working on.
Mm-hmm. And sometimes that's okay because it won't take away from the main change, but sometimes if it does, then it has to be carefully considered. Right, Bob?
Yes, Emily. So how much back and forth do you have to do with all of this to get a bipartisan workable agreement, something that's going to make it through the process, whatever that process happens to be in this era of divided government?
Mm-hmm. As with the legislative work, it helps to have the relationships with our friends on the other side of the aisle that I've enjoyed for over a decade. I think that makes all the difference. There are politics bound every year, but to be able to talk through specific issues with people across the aisle takes a tremendous amount of time. And when the trust is there to begin with, that can be cut down a bit. So I think what I'm saying is that the conversation to get to an end spot never ends until if it's a legislative bill, ends up on the governor's desk and is ready to be signed. And there's always more we can do to find common ground.
So talk to me, you mentioned relationships and the importance of relationships. How does that play into the decisions you make on an ongoing basis when you're balancing relationships against policy changes and the importance of maintaining both good working relationships with folks so you can continue to make policy later, but then also achieving policy ends that are in line with the mission and vision and ideals of the party you're representing?
Yeah, this is a tricky one, and there's no hard and fast rule. I think that having issue area specialists that work in our policy team who know what is a line that is not crossable for certain interest groups are able to steer policy goals that the governor has into a place where more people win than not. But as you know, it's always going to be a mixed bag. If you want to get the main thing done, then there may have to be a bit of a give so that it's workable for all groups involved and that no entity gets too badly offended so that you can continue a good working relationship. And that's really important to get things done in the future.
So obviously the pandemic has dominated the work of government for the last 8+ months, going on, 9 months now, 10 months?
Long time.
But looking past the current challenges, recognizing that it might be a little while before we get there, but looking past the current challenges, what are some goals you'd like to achieve once Michigan's beaten COVID-19, looking into that area and maybe even looking back a little bit before this all started and reflecting on some of the things that were outstanding back then?
Yeah, there are the last 8 or 9 months have been a tremendously trying time for the people of Michigan and for people in public service and for frontline workers and I am including your membership and students in that too. This has been a hard time for everyone. But the last couple weeks, what we have been doing is picking up the policy goals that the governor has outlined during her first 2 years in office, lifting them up and giving them a 365-degree look to make sure that the pandemic we're still leading with our values and we are still focusing on the right policy change. For example, with healthcare, we saw the pandemic hit certain minority populations harder than it hit other populations. So we're looking at things like access to healthcare. If there is access to healthcare, why aren't people signing up for it? And what can we do to make that connection? Or another thing that we're looking at in terms of the economy is childcare. We saw 865,000 women leave the workforce in September, and I think under 100,000 men during the same time. Childcare has become a real issue during this pandemic, and how do we bolster up a public system? Is that the right move in order to create more equity in the workforce? So those are the types of things that we're lifting up to look at. And, I guess that doesn't answer your question of what my specific goals are. But I know that I can tell you that the governor and our team are interested in looking at what she's laid out over the last 2 years to make sure that we're on the right track to best serve the people of Michigan.
Well, and I think you hit on a little bit of this earlier, right? You guys, before this all started, you had the 60 by 30 goal. Now, as this has moved on, you've been able to get some traction and agreement around Futures for Frontliners,
Yep.
which is a program that moves in that direction. So eyes on the vision, but still working within the new reality that we're dealing with now with COVID. So I don't think you dodged the question. I think the idea of holding everything up and giving it a 360-degree view now that we have a new reality is not a bad way to frame that. Last question, because I know your time is precious, especially with everything going on and lame duck happening right now. For someone who's, are there particular thinkers or books or other ideas that have influenced your perspective on your job? This is a conversation we've had before. That somebody who might be interested in looking at this, you would recommend them take a look at, think about, dive into a little bit more deeply?
So first off, I want everybody to know that Bob did not prep me for this question. And when I first started lobbying and I said, how do I do this job? He handed me Getting to Yes, which is a great book that you should read if you'd like to understand lobbying 101. I just finished a book called Grace Notes by Brian Doyle. And while he is technically a Catholic author, he writes a lot about everyday joy and everyday simplicity and how to see some of the silver linings in situations that you may not otherwise. I think this is my fourth book that I read by him during this pandemic because it's the inspiration that I need as a public servant in order to take care of my family and also do the best that I possibly can. Do you mind if George comes in, Bob?
No.
Come on in. He's going to nap, so.
Come
here, honey.
Hey, George.
You want to wave? All right. I love you.
Thanks for joining us, George. Pandemic parenting.
Yeah, pandemic parenting. You're doing it too.
Yes, indeed. All right. Well, I want to respect your time. Thank you for joining us today, Emily, and kind of walking us through your perspective on this and showing us a little bit into your world, pulling back the curtain a little bit on how public policy is really made.
Well, thank you so much for having me. And I wish I could be with all of the students during the actual event. I'm so glad you guys are interested in public service. We need you. So please don't give up that interest and pursue it if you feel like it's what you are meant to do, or if you just have a little interest in it. I know our office is always looking for interns, college interns, so don't forget about that if you find yourself in college needing an internship.
And Michigan State is conveniently close to the state capital, so
Mm-hmm.
you can go green and work in state government. It's a good thing.
Indeed. Thanks, Rob.
Thank you, Emily.
Bye.